Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natalie Beloy, and I am so pleased to see a mix of students from Salish Sea Studies and other programs at Western and beyond, regional leaders and community members and media professionals listening in today. Thanks for signing into the Reporting on Ecotopia event this morning. I'm the Associate Director for Transboundary Initiatives at Western Washington University, and I support the Border Policy Research Institute, the Center for Canadian American Studies, and the Salish Sea Institute. All of these programs sponsored today's event along with the Salish Sea Communications and the Journalism Department at Western. Thank you to everyone for your support. I'm signing in today from Bellingham, Washington, built on the lands and the waters of the Lummi and Laktamish people and the Nooksack tribe. In my efforts at Western to support cross-border teaching and research in this region, I'm often reminded that the Canada-US border is a very recent phenomenon. Indigenous peoples have lived here for more than 10,000 years, and the border and all the cities of the Salish Sea today are less than 200 years old. That means the border has been here for less than 2% of human history in this place. I hope today's conversation can prompt creative thinking about bridging this border that, while young and recent, presents pretty big and real challenges for collaboration and connectedness in our region. And I think our panelists will all have great ideas about that. For the remainder of the event, I'll be monitoring the Q&A along with our colleagues at the Alumni Association. Thank you so much for your support creating this program for us. Please utilize the Q&A to ask questions of our panelists at any time. And we recommend using the speaker view setting on Zoom during this call. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Derek Moscato, who inspired this event with his recent report for the Border Policy Research Institute, Reporting on Cascadia. Derek Moscato is an associate professor in the Department of Journalism at Western Washington University and a research fellow with Western's Border Policy Research Institute. A 20-page Center for Integrity and Public Communications scholar, his research examines the confluence of environmental media, strategic communication, and public diplomacy. His recent projects focus on cross-border media ecosystems in Cascadia, the communication ramifications of the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States, and the soft power of global sport. Derek holds a PhD from the University of Oregon's School of Journalism and Communication, and he'll be moderating today's panel. Over to you, Derek. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Appreciate that. And I just wanted to thank everybody for attending this special cross-border media panel devoted to environmental journalism in the Salish Sea and Cascadia regions. Western Washington University has long been immersed in research, teaching, and scholarly engagement devoted to the relationship between Canada and the United States. And today's event really continues a unique trajectory that situates the Western and Bellingham communities at this international juncture of nations. Today's event is titled Reporting on Ecotopia. And I like to think the term ecotopia is fitting for today's event. It was coined by the environmentalist Ernest Callenbach in his 1975 book of the same name, Ecotopia. Callenbach envisioned the Pacific Northwest as an independent bioregion. And in many ways, he was decades ahead of his time. As the Los Angeles Times quipped, he predicted, quote, with uncanny accuracy, a world where recycling is commonplace, food is locally grown, and energy comes from the sun. And I wanted to thank one of our attendees today who pointed out that the late Callenbach indeed visited Western as part of Earth Day back in 1977. But this notion of ecotopia raises questions about how we achieve a vision of a cross-border Cascadia and Salish Sea region that emphasizes quality of life, innovation, and environmental protection. These are themes that I explored, as Natalie mentioned, with the Border Policy Research Institute, devoted to the borderlands media ecosystem of journalists and news enterprises. And I would encourage all of you to visit the Institute to read our recently published reports, including a new one this week devoted to international media coverage of Point Roberts, Washington, amid the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, I wanted to alert you to the Salish Sea Institute's exceptional State of the Salish Sea report, which is actually going to be published, I believe, later today. So please keep your eyes out for that one. Just one more thing I wanted to mention is that today's panel is really the result of many conversations I've had with journalists in our region during this research with the Institute. And in spite of the well-publicized challenges that journalists and the journalism industry is facing in 2021, I've learned that media professionals are very much motivated to share their vision of Cascadia with audiences and with their colleagues on both sides of the border. So The topics they cover, I mean, it's worth noting, are substantial in terms of the public policy and global ramifications. So my hope is that today's dialogue will in turn further long-term relationships and conversations between media professionals right across the region. So all of that is to say is that today is just a start. Our plan is to explore more cross-border media themes such as transportation, business innovation, tribal engagement, and sport and culture in the months and years to come. In addition to our partners, including Salish Sea Communications, I wanted to express major gratitude to today's presenters, who are incredibly accomplished journalists and writers in their fields. Jude Isabella is an award-winning science journalist and founder of British Columbia-based Hakai magazine, which does some extraordinary work in the realm of coastal science and society. Lisa Johnson helps to tell Canada's environmental story as the producer of CBC Radio's national climate change program, What on Earth, and she's a senior writer for CBC News in British Columbia. And Linda Mapes has won numerous awards nationally for her science and environmental reporting at the Seattle Times. And this comes on top of her authorship of 5 books devoted to these themes. And there's a new one coming up just around the corner. Book launch is on June the 1st. And Mike Sato from our sponsor, Salish Sea Communications. He's the managing editor of the Salish Current. He's the curator for the Salish Sea News and Weather. This is a weekday news blog that really is a must read for those of us engaged with these kind of issues. So I am thrilled that we could bring this group together amid these challenging times. Mike is going to set the stage for us about the role of environmental journalism in Cascadia. We'll then hear from our 3 panelists, and from there, we'll move into the question and answer dialogue format. So thank you again, and over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you out there for sitting in on a beautiful Friday. I'm Mike Sato, and I'm currently the managing editor of Salish Current. Salish Current is a year-and-a-half old. It's an online not-for-profit news service. We report on local issues and events in Whatcom, San Juan, and Skagit counties. For the last 15 years, I've also posted Salish Sea News and Weather. It's a weekday curation of news links to regional environmental stories. Both Salish Sea News and Weather and Salish Current are open access because they're public services, they're not for profit products. So I invite you to check them out. They're free and you can't beat the price. For most of my working life, I've been reading, talking, and writing about Puget Sound, the Northwest Straits, the Georgia Basin, the Sound and Straits, the Salish Sea, our transboundary waters, transboundary, our cross-border shared land and waters. In 1986, the first Puget Sound Water Quality Management Plan addressed what was called, quote, the unfinished agenda, unquote. One of the agenda items was the policy issues that affected the shared waters of Puget Sound and Georgia Strait. In 1992, nonprofit environmental groups like People for Puget Sound and Georgia Strait Alliance met and adopted a, quote, transboundary goal to work together on issues affecting both sides of our water border. In 1994, the governments of Washington and British Columbia designated a forum of 6 scientists to report on critical issues affecting our shared waters. The report spurred formal meetings of intergovernmental agencies addressing the multiplicities of jurisdictions and regulations. Many meetings, but little progress. So the governmental activists tried to push the government by mapping the marine resources of the border area and declaring it the Orca Pass Stewardship Area. Every once in a while, sometimes at transboundary science conferences, a forum is held on cross-border cooperation. Or another School of Marine Affairs thesis is written about the benefits and barriers of international stewardship. Any reasonable person would ask, why can't governments work together to address the waters and lands and resources as a regional ecosystem? Many of the issues we face today in this shared cross-border region are the same as in the 90s. Some are worsening. Declining whale populations, declining salmon stocks, declining herring and forage fish, the dangers of vessel accident and oil spills. Change comes slowly, sometimes too slowly, but we're working to make things better. We're taking down dams and correcting fish passages we'd screwed up. Maybe we've helped recover groundfish populations by establishing no-take protected areas and catch limits. Maybe we've given the whales more of a chance by reducing vessel noise and harassment. And we don't need to say beautiful British Columbia with a smirk now that Victoria treats its sewage. And one major change in the last 3 decades has been the leadership role taken by the tribes and First Nations. They've spoken forcefully and acted to protect our ecosystems, lands, waters, and resources. They are true co-managers, and it behooves us to hold up our end as co-managers. It won't be easy. The risks of a vessel accident will increase when the Roberts Bank terminal is expanded by the Port of Vancouver and the Trans Mountain second oil pipeline comes to Burnaby. Today's population is 2.5 million in the Vancouver metro area and 5 million in the Puget Sound Basin, and it'll grow. That growth will accelerate pressures on land use, transportation, recreation, and social and economic justice. And let's not forget climate change and sea level rise, ocean acidification, and hopefully no more pandemics. The future has arrived, and there's more to come. Look at our cross-border issues this way. Here, where I sit in Bellingham, is the center of the universe, an hour-and-a-half drive away from 2 major metropolitan areas. I have to believe that there will be journalists who will continue to report the news in Puget Sound and in British Columbia. And I'm not so certain how readers will find that news, but the fate and future of the news business, that's left for another forum. But who will tell the stories of the Salish Sea ecosystem, the stories of our shared land and waters? I used to characterize the cross-border ecosystem as a place where the whales and the eagles and the salmon didn't know the difference between loonies and toonies and dollars and cents. I recently got a hot tip that research indicates that some orca whales crossing the border can distinguish between them. Isn't that amazing? But how would we know that unless there's somebody to report it? Maybe Jude, Linda, and Lisa will tell us about it. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. We'll now turn it over to Jude Isabella from Hakai Magazine.
Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for inviting me to this panel. I really appreciate it. I'm excited about it. I think there's a lot we can do to collaborate and coordinate our reporting for this region. There are many things I can probably talk about. Salmon hatcheries for one, and hopefully Linda and I are going to be working on that together in a cross-border kind of way. The Columbia River Treaty, it's a great cross-border topic as well. The herring fishery, whales, Indigenous rights to hunt, fish, or trap on either side of the border, food security, and local fisheries. Those are all really exciting to me. But I want to mention something I haven't heard a lot about lately. I did a lot last year at the beginning of the pandemic, but we haven't heard a lot about it, I think, in the last few months. And it has to do with marine vessel traffic, in particular, cruise ships. Now, let me paint a picture for you. Carnival's Legend arrives at Ogden Point in Victoria at 7:30 p.m. on September 2nd, 2019, before COVID. The tourists leave to discover downtown Victoria. Believe me, there's a lot of them. Or they take an 80-minute bus ride to the Butchart Gardens with what precious little time they have in town. The workers, meanwhile, are busy unloading the ship with cargo specifically for Victoria. It's a week's worth of garbage and recycling. This was Legend's second to last night after a week cruising from Seattle up to Glacier Bay and Ketchikan and back. Now, the Port of Seattle says that it lacks the capacity to handle trash. So Victoria's Ogden Point built an expanded waste processing facility on their pier, which is not zoned industrial, I don't think, to help handle the 150 tons of cruise ship waste that the industry leaves here each month during the season. So when Legend pulls back from the dock at midnight, it heads to its home port of Seattle, a couple of tons of garbage lighter, right? Victoria, by the way, is only, I don't know, it's not that much richer. They get about 150 tons per garbage, $150 per ton. Now consider that on that ship, there are 930 employees, and many of them aren't paid anything close to a living wage. Now beneath the sea, we've got marine mammals such as killer whales, who are not only annoyed by the sound of the engines, but they're swimming through traces of toxic metals and carcinogenic PAHs washed into the ocean by the ship's scrubbers. Now, by the way, a 2019 study found that in 2017, 35 million tons of scrubber discharge water was dumped into coastal BC waters. 90% of this was from cruise ships. And sewage gets dumped into Canadian waters because regulations are tougher in Alaska and Washington and much tougher in California. But I mean, we share the same marine life, so this is slightly insane. Now, 7 months after Legend's early September cruise, COVID hits, and suddenly it's all quiet. Presumably, the air and the water are cleaner. Now, when you look at Carnival's Glacier Bay excursions, they cruise up the Inside Passage and they bring tons of people to the West Coast, and it's gotten busier and busier and busier. I just know this from living in Victoria for the last, I mean, I lived in Victoria for 30 years, but the last 5 years has been incredible. And the industry overall has grown. In recent years, the cruise ship industry has boomed into a $40 billion juggernaut. And more broadly, as the business has grown, so too have the ships. They've more than quadrupled in size since the 1990s, making them 220,000 ton monsters on average. These larger ships, they have climbing walls, ice rinks, theaters, dining halls, malls, spas, and casinos. And you know, I'm not really sure why people don't go to Vegas, but I kind of get why people cruise too. In any case, the growth in ship size has also increased the environmental impacts in our waters. Now, there's been a parallel growth in protests from residents in ports of call. They're frustrated. They're frustrated with the environmental degradation, the overcrowding, exploitation, and labor violations. So when the pandemic hit and cruises stopped in March 2020, port residents around the world saw their chance and they formed the Global Cruise Activist Network, GCAN. I'm sure this isn't news to all of you. That was last September. So Mark Gardner at the James Bay Neighborhood Association in Victoria is part of it, as is Stacey Oakes, who started the Seattle Cruise Control. And they've gotten some press when they first launched. I had our researcher and writer sit in on a call in December with them so she could, we thought, okay, how can we make a story out of this? Because we already actually did a big cruise piece last year. But they haven't gotten a ton of press. And I'm not sure how much they've accomplished in the last less than a year since September. Their message, however, was simple. When cruises return, make them better neighbors, environmentally and economically, and labor-wise, help them become more equitable. And this is interesting, right? Because labor laws, what does that have to do with environmental degradation? Well, it has to do with social justice, which often has to do with environmental justice. And cruise ships employees are notoriously underpaid. In the US, this happens because there's a border between Canada and the US. There's a century-old bit of legislation called the Jones Act, and it mandates that workers be paid fairly if it's a US boat and it stops in all US ports. By stopping in Victoria, not only do cruise lines take advantage of laxer environmental laws and they get garbage pickup, but they also avoid fines at the wages they pay their workers. And estimates suggest that US ships save a cumulative $700 million in fines each year simply by stopping in Victoria on their way to Seattle. Now, GCAN doesn't want to ban ships. They just want them to be good neighbors. And like I said, I get why people cruise. You have a multi-generational family. A cruise is actually a pretty easy thing to do. How else are you going to see the shrinking glaciers in Alaska? The industry isn't going away. And it's not our job to sink an industry, but as environmental journalists, it's our job to hold industry and governments accountable. And then consider this. Now, before we realized COVID was going to linger longer than anticipated, Victoria expected 320 cruise ships in 2021. this year. And if they were full capacity, that would be a 32% increase in passengers from 2019. That's kind of crazy. I live and work downtown. I know how crazy it gets. But trying to deal with the cruise industry is emblematic of dealing with shipping in general. It's a diffuse industry. You can't personally boycott shipping in general. So many of our goods get here by ship. And any one city boycotting a cruise ship won't achieve anything. A cruise company will simply pull up anchor and head to another port. And they've done that in the Caribbean. They've punished certain small countries. So for the sake of the ocean environment, for neighborhoods and their residents, for marine life, I think this is a cross-border issue that would benefit from cross-border reporting. And then just one last thing to say here. I think Seattle's cruise season starts June 5th this year. We're not opening our borders, but already Carnival's booked 200 their cruises for 2022 past the capacity we had in 2019. So that's kind of crazy. Anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking about cross-border wise. There's a lot of other things, but I thought I'd put that out there because it might be something that would benefit from a collaboration of some sort.
Thank you very much, Jude. And our next speaker is Linda Mapes from the Seattle Times.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about this transboundary region that we share and cherish. I really appreciated that opening context in terms of how brief our human history is here. I think that's really important to remember. This is a fragile place, and we're making a pretty good mess of it very quickly. I also want to sort of in friendship poke a little bit at Mike's assertion that we can allow the beautiful natural British Columbia thing without a smirk now. I don't know. I kind of have a chip on my shoulder about some of what's going on in Canada, big time from my seat down here in Washington State, because, you know, this transboundary place that we share, honestly, some of the most alarming trends underway right now in forestry are going on as I sit here in BC. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the logging of old growth forests in BC, which has continued unabated, despite all the promises to take a closer look and reevaluate and all this rope-a-dope about, gee, we'll consider it, we'll talk about it, we'll think about it, we'll study it some more. They're cutting trees right now all around the Fairy Creek watershed, which is in Fort Renfrew. So right across from Port Angeles on our side of the water on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This is a precious basin. Fairy Creek has never been logged, and it leads directly to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, right where orcas feed. So these are salmon-bearing waters in these freshwater creeks and streams, and we are talking about old growth, precious, low elevation, gigantic, druidic forests. In BC, you've got, depending on who you talk to, 1.5%, 1%, 2% of those original forests left. Still cutting. And this, by the way, is so-called crown land. Now, what's that exactly? Good question. You know, you talk to some of the Nunchalag bands, and what they'll tell you is they never fought a war. They didn't sign a treaty. People just kind of like came in and started cutting trees and called it crown lands. And some of those bands are fighting heroically to reassert their sovereignty, which they never ceded over those lands in Nootka Sound and so forth, just to try to get a hold of and control over these forests before they're all gone. So, you know, I think this forestry issue really is worth our attention, because these old growth forests, if you want to talk about climate change, and you want to talk about the planet, there's no greater importance than keeping these last forests standing. Any forest, any tree. There's a lot of hocus pocus right now. BC is a really big part of this whole pellet trade. What am I talking about? I'm talking about chopping down trees and using some of the residue and even whole trees in the round to make pellets, and ship them as far as the UK for so-called alternative renewable fuel. This is madness. I mean, if you look at the carbon dynamics of pelletizing a tree and shipping it across the Atlantic to Europe, you tell me how that's carbon neutral. I guarantee you it's not. And in terms of, carbon and the planet, the last thing we should be doing is cutting any more old growth anywhere for any reason, and any scientist will assert that. Here in the United States, we're far from perfect. Here in Washington state, we're far from perfect, but we're better than either Oregon or BC in our management of forests. Back in 1994, President Clinton convened the Forest Conference in Portland to end the war in the woods over old growth in the United States. And in 1994, the Northwest Forest Plan was signed into law. And what did it do? It set aside millions of acres, 10 million acres in Western Washington, Oregon, and even parts of Northern California, old growth permanently for preservation. Those trees stand today. This was allegedly done to protect the spotted owl. We really know what it was all about. It was about those big trees. And the communities that relied on cutting those trees today are still cutting trees. They're cutting forests that are already in industrial status. They're regrowth of prior cuts. Some of those timber mills had to resize so that they could work with smaller material. But you know the story, timber prices are through the roof. You can't even satisfy the demand. So the timber industry is going along just fine. So all the talk that we couldn't do this, the timber industry would be created forever, that didn't happen. So we set aside 10 million acres of old growth on federal lands in the United States in 1994. And then in October of this year, we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Forest and Fish Agreement, which was negotiated between tribes and the state of Washington and private landowners and our state Department of Natural Resources to set standards for timber harvest on private land and state land in Washington. This is on both the dry side of the mountains and on the wet side of the mountains. And it, for the first time, set wider buffers along streams to protect salmon and initiated a whole range of other protections. And these forest lands are in active production today on both sides of the state with a far greater level of protection for the environment than we see in either BC or Oregon. And so I want to talk about this because we are one connected bioregion, and to the extent that we are cutting old growth in BC, that's hurting the climate, the airshed that we all share. It's also hurting the salmon streams that feed the orcas that we all cherish. In Washington state, we can do better, and should continue to do better with our stewardship of our forests. But we can prove to both Oregon and BC that it's possible to have a timber industry without cutting the very last of your old growth, or for that matter, cutting with the kind of lack of restraint that's allowed in BC and in Oregon. Our timber industry is the envy of the world. We're the second largest producer of dimensional lumber in the world. So we're doing just fine, even though we have much tighter restrictions than you do in BC. And we don't touch old growth on either state lands or federal lands, not unless it's by mistake or a fire line or something that went wrong. But policy, both state and federal in the United States on the West Coast, is you don't touch it because it's too ecologically valuable. There's no defensible scientific argument to cut one last stick of old growth anywhere. So that's what I wanted to talk about. It's kind of my screed. My email box has been filled this morning with very sad news of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police going after timber protesters who are bravely sitting in the tops of old growth trees in Fairy Creek. Some of them have actually buried part of their bodies underground and locked themselves to timber equipment. This is the kind of stuff that went on in Clayoquot Sound. It's still going on. It's still going on, and it's going on right under your noses as we sit here and have this panel right now, this morning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. Our next speaker is Lisa Johnson from CBC.
Hi, everyone. this is a really important topic, and I'm really honored to share the screen with the other panelists and hosts. Right now, I produce a climate change program at CBC as so the Canadian public broadcaster, as Derek mentioned. I've also worked though in TV and radio and online in sort of the general news melee. So yes, doing science and environment stories, but also like wildfires and kidnappings and a Stanley Cup riot and that sort of thing. So I'm going to make a few remarks about that news ecosystem and some of the challenges of covering environment stories in there well. And I just wanted to side note, when you talk about the dry side and the wet side of the mountains, I am Canadian, but I grew up in Washington State on the dry side of the mountains. I don't know if anyone knows about the Hanford nuclear plant, probably fairly familiar to Washington State people. So I went to Hanford High and I'm from there. So in a busy newsroom, and many of them don't have a dedicated, they're not a dedicated magazine like Jude runs or environment reporter like Linda is. Environment stories can be tough to sort of make the news. And part of it is that the media has such a bias that can get in the way of covering them well. And bias is a real triggery word, but I'm not talking about politics in this case. I'm talking about a bias for stories, and in particular for stories like for stories that fit in the rubric of what we consider news. And so, you know, what is a news story? These are often things, you know, that are specific and that are tangible and that are simple. Perhaps they have a clear cause, a clear villain, even better in a narrative. And that is not how a lot of environment stories work, right? Especially climate change, like the biggest looming story. It's gradual and ongoing, it's global. It's more visible, but it has, you know, for many years, it's been not very visible to people in these two countries. And it's complex, and there are a lot of different factors. And that's why I love this quote that has been shared for years from the renowned climate change reporter, Andy Revkin, formerly of the New York Times, saying, you're never going to see a headline that says climate change broke out today. And he's right, because of how that sort of this hurdle in the news world of like really gravitating towards the new and the now. And, you know, I really appreciate the way Jude was telling the story of the issue of cruise ships by making a story of like one pulling into dock on one day. There are many tricks that, you know, ace storytellers have from making big topics into stories, but it is one of the things that, you know, I like to tell people about if they wonder, why is this not getting the coverage it deserves? And certainly I would say in BC, even with the like acute story right now of the Fairy Creek protesters getting arrested, it's not getting the coverage that it deserves. In part because the bigger pieces around that arrest, around the standoff and the images that we could take today that make it so significant, those gradual, ongoing, contextual, more complex things that have led to today, they're often what news media is bad at covering well, despite everyone working their best, but just with smaller budgets and fewer specialists who cover those things. You know, I think that we have a similar kind of hurdle when you talk about cumulative effects on species at risk. We have a real bias for characters, right? And the ongoing multifactorial problems are harder. So if you think about grizzly bears and the way that they've been covered in BC, so as I understand it, mostly extirpated from Washington State, hardly any grizzlies there anymore. And BC has half of Canada's grizzlies, has thousands of grizzlies. Still very threatened populations in some pockets, some other pockets where humans aren't interfering as much or doing better. And the biggest issues have to do with habitat, right? It's where roads have cut through, it's human encroachment, it's agriculture, it's these small 1,000 cuts kind of stories. But up until the last couple of years, when trophy hunting was banned, for sure, the number one thing that would make the news would be the trophy hunt versus these bigger ongoing issues that were leading to so many, you know, the land not being able to support these wide-ranging top predators, right, on the land. And, I think about that as well with the southern resident killer whales, who I'm obviously not the expert in this panel on. Certainly Linda's coverage has led the region on what's been going on with those orcas. But when you think about the headlines in the summer of 2018, the play-by-play chase of one sick orca being trailed by researchers on both sides of the border and shot with antibiotics. And of course, is it Telqua? Is that how I say her name? The mother who carried her dead baby for 17 days. Like those, especially the mother and baby, and I was pregnant at the time, so it was an emotional thing for me to cover. Those are the stories that made the international headlines versus, the ongoing cumulative declining salmon pollution, noise pollution issues that we that need to really be getting the action in an ongoing way. Of course, it's our jobs to overcome that, and I think the people here do that. But it's an important way to, I guess, remember some of the challenges in getting these kind of stories the coverage that they need and the sustained attention that they need, right? Because it is not. I remember writing a killer whale piece that summer of like the killer whale problem that a shot won't stop, right? Like the narrative was being covered, at least, on our side of the border and by the general news media, often as like this latest update on the health of this whale and what, the first time ever attempts that are being done in a way that the cumulative effects, of course, were not being covered. So I want to put that out for discussion, maybe venting if people have issues with how these things get covered. In terms of a story that I really keep and keeping my eye on and find both fascinating and disturbing, and it's a bit wider than the Salish Sea, but thinking I guess of Cascadia, is where nature is crossing borders increasingly because of climate change. And I'll just mention briefly the story that I've covered, but first heard about when I was at a meeting of ecologists, people who work in the Arctic. And, we're hearing all the very cool things that they get to do when working on polar bears, okay, yeah, and seabirds, and eider ducks, okay, all Arctic species I was expecting. And then a biologist from Winnipeg, actually, saying she works on salmon in the Arctic. And I was like, just kind of filing through my brain, salmon in the Arctic. Are there salmon in the Arctic? I didn't know there was salmon in the Arctic. And it turns out there are now, right? There had been, some wingnut explorer salmon who have traditionally shown up in small numbers in the Western Arctic. In terms of traditional knowledge, we know that has been happening, but in recent years, they've been showing up in record numbers, and species of Pacific salmon that have never been showing up that far out of what is considered their ranges before. In Fisheries and Oceans Canada, even had to put out a field guide to be identifying the different species of Pacific salmon in Inuktitut, because the Inuit fishermen were not familiar with them and sort of what to do with them. So this is one part of this redistribution of life on Earth that is happening. I'll just share in the chat for people to check out later an episode of our show that we touched on this, but scientists have documented thousands of range shifts in species. So moving towards the poles, moving up mountains as well. And, as someone who lives and works in BC, the Arctic story, my mind immediately went to what's going on with declining salmon populations down south on both sides of the border. And although there are a bunch of causes, obviously warming water is one of them, and one that definitely is happening now, and among all the other causes is part of what's going on with Pacific salmon here. So that's only a few species, but it's happening all over the place. And as you said, the borders don't matter. They matter to our laws, our regulations, but not to nature. And increasingly things will be showing up either from the south to the north, or importantly, also in a mismatch we can anticipate with where protected areas have been, or where, say, a migrating bird is used to this weather, is used to those insects being available at the right time. Those mismatches will be happening. And that's a big story that I'm super interested in.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. Just a fascinating discussion from all of our panelists. I wanted to thank all of you. I wanted to sort of summarize a few things that we are hearing today. Firstly, if you do have questions for our Q&A, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to put questions in. And just to sort of summarize what we've heard over the last half hour or so, Mike, you kicked things off by sort of underscoring sort of our regional connection to the natural world, the idea that this is really embedded in our regional DNA. We are indeed a bioregion in Cascadia. But you also, really called out the shared responsibility that we all have a part to play in this. Journalism, government, industry, all of the institutions that comprise Cascadia and the Salish Sea region. And that was a really nice platform to set up Jude's discussion, I think, on this notion of cross-border logistics. And one great example of the US-Canadian economy in play, and some of the environmental sort of implications of that. And you're making a call for really important cooperation between government and industry and the role that the media can play. So this really gets into how do we impact public policy for environmental benefit in the Cascadia region. And you sort of left off with a hopeful note that we can do more collaboration between media to sort of add more sort of complexity and layers to these, really complicated stories. Linda, you really sort of underscored the importance of the media's role in cross-border government accountability, and that we are seeing a discrepancy sometimes between what one jurisdiction needs and how another jurisdiction is behaving in an environmental context. You also remind us very importantly that this region is immersed in some of the most significant environmental milestones in the history of environmentalism, quite frankly, from Southern Oregon to Vancouver Island. So it's really important that we have that context. And finally, similar to Jude's discussion, you really sort of highlighted Cascadia's connection to the global marketplace and global commodities, which is kind of a scary thing to remember, that we're immersed in these larger macroeconomic factors. And what is our role as media to sort of navigate, this really complex world. Finally, Lisa, thank you for highlighting the importance of news values in environmental reporting. And I think that this is something that as an industry, we can do a better job of. I think in journalism schools, we can do a better job of, because you've highlighted a real problem, I think, that sort of is across the board when it comes to the way stories are told, not just in environmentalism, but sort of throughout the media. So, you ask these questions about what are the stories that are getting told and who gets to tell the stories. And I think these are really important questions for us to be contemplating, particularly in a cross-border context. And that gets us to this idea that we need to create some kind of sustainability of journalistic attention, that we need to sort of have more longevity for these stories. And that gets us into the ecology of news and setting up good business models for environmental journalism. And you left off with a couple of really important points, I thought. One was the cross-border implications of climate change and shifting habitats, and really the unknown future that awaits as a result of climate change. And I think that's just a very important point. And then finally, I really appreciated that you sort of took us to the Arctic, because I think it's important to remember that Cascadia neighbors is adjoined to other global ecosystems, and essentially these ecosystems are connected. So on that note, I think we'll shift now to our Q&A, and we do have some questions coming in. I wanted to first ask a question about the model of journalism that might best work for the future. And so I'm going to put that out. So maybe we can start with you, Jude. what is the model of journalism that you think is best positioned to succeed in this kind of cross-border environmental reporting, given that we have lots of costs and complexities to consider?
Yeah, we're fortunate in that we're funded by the Tula Foundation, a family funded, charity in British Columbia. So we don't have to worry that much about fundraising. We do fundraise for our fellowships, but there's been in the US, they just started this in Canada, but for a long time you could have nonprofit journalism enterprises, right? And you couldn't have that here. So a charity in Canada couldn't be political, right? That would endanger their charity status. So that really put a damper on those kind of journalistic endeavors. Although the Narwhal has just, they're registered as a nonprofit journalism now, entity now in Canada. So that's very encouraging. So I think those nonprofit models where you really get your audience behind you on that is a really shining light in that. I think there should be grants for that from governments because we know how essential journalism is to democracy, and an independent journalism for sure. As for cross-border, Investigate West started this decarbonizing project, and they have journalists on both sides of the border, and they're looking at different stories from Cascadia. I think it's collaboration. It's taking a Canadian and a US entity, because I'm not sure we could have a cross-border entity like that, considering the legalities of what when we have different libel laws, right, in Canada and the US. But like, I reached out to Linda about this fish hatchery, salmon hatcheries package, and we're talking about that. So it's kind of making those connections and networking and trying to pool our resources, because then we could tell bigger stories. If we're only paying, let's say, for half of a piece from the two entities, and we generally speaking have different audiences, and you get our larger audience that way. So I hope that answers your question, but I think these collaborations, nonprofit journalism is really hopeful.
Terrific. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
I think it's a really good point, Jude, because I think that, over here on this side of the border, I mean, we have a lot more options in terms of, nonprofit journalism, independent journalism. And I think that's, one of the ways in which, Salish Current is starting out right now. I think that, it gives us the opportunity to be independent, but it also, makes us very, very much dependent on donors and our readership to support us. It's basically an NPR kind of model. And I think that, if this grows in a way, but again, I mean, like Investigate West, you really do need the kind of firepower to be able to carry out the kind of reporting that really is going to make a difference. We start out by being very, very localized and hope to grow from that. And at some point, it'd be really great if by concentrating on the 3 northern Puget Sound counties, we have the opportunity to actually, work some of the coverage over on the other side and to talk about, things that go on just the other side of the border and truly be transboundary. But again, looking at it as an ecosystem, but as a not-for-profit, as an independent media source.
Great. Linda, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that the paper I work for, the Seattle Times, is independently owned and family owned and in the same family since 1886. That's really unusual in the United States, and we benefit from it hugely, because it means if we want to dig into something like the Southern Resident Orca story, we don't have to get permission from some hedge fund back in New York. We do what we want. And the Blevin family has owned this paper for so long. We're into the 5th generation. And those kids work, they write stories, they sell car ads, they work, they're not, and the family corporation has been structured in such a way that no one individual can take a lot of money out of it. So it was very intelligently set up as a public trust. And so we, the journalists, have really benefited from that. It's very much a reporter driven paper. And we don't hear from the fifth floor. We go out and we do what we think needs to be done, and they provide the resources to do it. It's really a privilege to work at an independent family-owned paper that's right here in Seattle. It's like craft brewed beer. I mean, really, I'm so proud to work for a locally owned newspaper that's producing Pulitzer Prize winning journalism for this community right here. So I just couldn't resist saying that even though we're not structured as a nonprofit, although we don't make any money, we are motivated by those same community service, public service values. And interestingly, at the Seattle Times, we begin hatching a little bit of a hybrid model. I just want to mention this so listeners understand that this is a changing picture. You don't have only CBC or only all the way nonprofit. You also have these sort of really interesting hybrids like the Seattle Times, where it's privately owned, privately held. But we have started in recent years to go out for funding for endowed reporting beats. So people like me, I'm a metro reporter. I do weekend shifts. I do everything. But then we also have some beats of paper, homelessness, traffic, education that are endowed by private donors. And those reporters are off in their intensively focused world writing about these particular topics. And we're expanding that, bringing in more philanthropy to do more endowed coverage. The NPR model, you also might think of it in the way you would think of an endowed chair at a university, where the funders have no say whatsoever in what we cover at any stage in the process: idea generation, execution, publication, zero say. But they are providing money for coverage they think is important, and it is helping us broaden and deepen our coverage of complex topics that Lisa is so correct. A lot of this stuff doesn't break, it oozes. It goes on for years and it can seem very incremental, but honestly, it is the big picture. Like in any kaleidoscope, you click it and you see the whole picture if you try to. And that's what good journalism is. You use that breaking news event to tell the larger story, which is exactly what we did with Tahlequah, the mother orca whale who was carrying her dead calf around. I mean, I used her as a window into now a multi-year examination of the southern resident killer whale story and how that is tied to the decline of Chinook salmon, which is in turn tied to the biological extinction crisis of many species. So I just wanted to mention that there are multiple models and even hybrids like what's going on at the Seattle Times. It's an exciting time to be a journalist for any students out there. I really want to encourage you to wade in, be brave, take this on as a career. It's a fantastic career. You can have both a creatively and intellectually stimulating job, but a job that also does good in the world. So, that's a lot in this life. If you can do work that you enjoy, from which you learn every day, that also helps the world. That's about as good as it gets, if you ask me. And we work now on every platform. I mean, at the Seattle Times, we make documentary films, we do podcasts, we write long form journalism, we write short, quick, breaking stuff, you name it, we do it. So whatever your passion, there's a place for it in journalism.
I think it's a good point, Linda. And, I think that the Seattle Times is, certainly, pursuing on that hybrid model, and we can have a discussion offline about the efficacy of that model. But I think that there are other publications that are having a real hard time at this point.
Sure.
And like we said, the Bellingham Herald is having a real hard time, and so is the Sound Publishing papers. And everybody's not doing it, and they're all trying different models. And that hybrid model is a tough one to grab onto.
Agreed. Totally agreed. And I grieve the loss of all these community papers. I mean, I started out in the Northwest as a political reporter for the Spokesman Review, covering the legislature out of Olympia. And back then, we had two houses stuffed with reporters, top, bottom, basically coming out the windows. We had everybody there from all over the state of Washington. Everybody sent a reporter to the Capitol to cover the legislative session. It's so sad today. The Capitol Press Corps has dwindled down to just a few people. In the Seattle Times, we used to have a bureau in Washington, D.C. with 2 reporters. Now we don't have a bureau at all in Washington, D.C. We used to have all these zoned editions all around the region. We don't have any of those anymore. So I don't want to sugarcoat. You're absolutely right, Mike. American journalism is in crisis, and it is local journalism in particular that is suffering. You know, it's interesting. You will look at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. They're in really kind of a heyday. They've never done better work, and they're really grabbing onto this online model. And I think for regional papers like the Seattle Times, you know, we have a little bit more room to work in this hybrid space, but I really am grieving the Sound Publishing Group. And I wrote a story about the Forks paper not long ago. They have 1 reporter covering the entire west end of the Olympic Peninsula. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? So that's basically everything from Port Angeles to saltwater and all the way south to the border. Crazy. That can't really be done. We all know that. And really important things are happening in that part of Washington state.
And just as a data point, I mean, over the years since I've been curating, you know, environmental stories that are, you know, that are written, you know, on both sides of the border. I mean, you know, the number of stories that are actually locally written have gone down considerably. So you can see that data point going down. Some of the scrambling that I have to do to have enough curated items to put up every weekday. I'm really happy that, you know, CBC does, you know, do a lot of spot news, and Vancouver's, you know, the Vancouver Sun picks that up. Hakai every once in a while. The Narwhal is always good for stuff, and Tyee is always good for things. So there's really quite a bit of action going up in British Columbia, which I really appreciate. Not the same kind of vibrancy, unfortunately, you know, in Puget Sound as much as it used to be. And
I agree.
I got to thank you, Linda, because, you know, you fill my pages every once in a while, and that's really great.
Excellent. All right. Well, I appreciate all of your comments here. I want to get to the next question, which is, what are some of the issues that we might overlook in cross-border ecological contexts? And do we actually underrate any particular stories or underreport them? And so I thought I'd send that question over to Lisa first.
I don't know if I have a good answer to this. I feel like we ignore a lot of, speaking from where I sit, like there's a lot of cross-border stuff that is ignored, in part. You know, we're the Canadian public broadcaster, and there's like there can be a real parochial sense of like, we cover, you know, our piece of this pie, right? And even in the different regions across Canada, there's different newsrooms covering their pieces of the pie. And so, you know, even within the country, different provinces, you know, the connections can be missed. And I definitely think that's happening with cross-border issues. Like I'm making notes on Washington's old growth logging rules, because, you know, I haven't seen that in the narratives up here. So I don't necessarily have, I would just say that we're not doing it a lot. There's a sense of considering your audience as like this more narrow thing, although I think people in British Columbia would certainly be interested in knowing parts of what goes on in the US. You know, obviously lots of things they wouldn't also, right? And it having grown up in Washington and now living in Canada for the last 20 years, like it can be very oddly different for being, I think, a region that is more united than I feel to lots of other parts of Canada. But it can be oddly different on the two sides of the border.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to take a shot at that question?
Well, I mean, I would second what Lisa says. I think that one of the reasons I wanted to be on this panel today and to celebrate your convening the panel, Derek, is I really think that this is something that we need to pay more attention to. I mean, these animals that we cover and these bioregions that we cover don't acknowledge a border, and for that matter, neither do the First People or the tribes of the Salish Sea. I mean, it's a total invention, and the idea that our work stops at the border is crazy. It absolutely has to be transboundary, and I think part of what happens is just practical. You know, it's time and energy and space and everything else. It's like, oh, now you want me to do that too? Well, yeah, actually, we kind of do, because It has to be done. And there's so much to learn when you bring in that perspective. So, I think Lisa's right. We don't do it nearly enough as we either should or must. And I think that the advent of some of these publications out of BC have been enormously helpful to me. Hakai's work is just terrific, and it's solid independent journalism, and I look at it frequently for the beauty of the writing, but also just the information that I need. So, and the CVC has always been there, so thank goodness for that. But when we put our pieces together, I think we each need to be thinking about, okay, so what else do I need to say about this, about the cross-border connection? And it's funny because the news lately in Washington has had so much to do with Canada, whether it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the carbon and orca and underwater noise aspects of that, or the tribal response to it, or for that matter, the expansion of the cargo terminal in the Fraser Delta, which absolutely affects those Fraser River fish, which are crucial for the southern resident orcas. And now this old growth disaster that's unfolding across the border. It's interesting. It's just, I feel like the Canadian news keeps kind of coming down here and hitting me over the head. It's just so essential. And I don't know if that's because I've changed or the news has changed, but it's very much in front mind for me.
Can I just add that one of the things that's funny that Americans might not know about Canadian media is how excited in this weird way Canada gets when anyone talks about them, being like a little sibling to America. And so, when the New York Times does ridiculous things about Canada, like almost like it's trolling the country, and that becomes like news here. And if a Seattle paper was like covering the Fairy Creek blockade, I feel like all of a sudden that would elevate it again. It's this national pastime of like being really weird about people paying attention to us.
I've actually heard that. I've had forest activists say to me, well, if you guys would write about it, it would just be so impactful because, et cetera, everything you just said. And I've been like, oh, really? But it is true. I know it to be true. And similarly on the fish farms. There's been endless news about the fish farms, and that news continues. And we've written about it a couple of times, and we need to do it more. It's just funny how Canada has so been in the news lately on the environmental front. I mean, you in many ways have been where some of the most interesting stories are over these last 18 months or so. And at least because of what I cover, that I don't see that slowing down.
There's the population issue also, because I think that, we're going to grow, and that's going to put tremendous amount of pressures on the infrastructure. When we take a look at, the pressures that going to put on land use as we accommodate a lot more people, it's also going to put, a lot of pressure on, on recreation. It's going to push out into wild areas. I mean, I think we've got a little bit of a breathing space right now, as Jude said, when we got to had a pandemic and things shut down for a while. And now we're going to see incredible pent up demand for getting out and, getting outside and doing things. The economic aspect as well as we grow. I mean, how do we grow in a way that's still sustainable, since we're not going to have, the same kind of extractive economy anymore that we used to have in the past? What's that economy going to be? What's the transportation system going to be like? Since it seems as if, we're miles away from being able to get from Vancouver to Seattle, because I'd like to hop onto that, somewhere in Bellingham, to be able to go in either direction easily. But it seems like that's a far away thing, but certainly necessary. And the whole idea of, some kind of, economic trade zone that would be able to, do things in a constructive way that provided, jobs and, boosts the local economy without ruining the environment. Those are the kinds of leadership issues, that really are important at this point.
Great. Let's get to a couple of questions from our registrants. One question was, climate change is a crisis affecting all species on this planet. How can the media convince people to care? I guess maybe we could extend that to, how can we convince people to care regionally about climate change, assuming that people aren't paying as much attention to the issue as they should be. Does anybody want to jump in?
I just went to a webinar yesterday. I attended, well, I went, I was on Zoom through MIT Night Science Journalism program. And it was about, getting people to care about climate change stories. And a couple of things, and I've heard this before, like they reiterated some points that I think I've heard in the last little while. One, focus on solutions. Climate change is here, things are changing. How are we adapting? Are there some examples where adaptation is happening, or we're looking at it, we're exploring it, maybe we can make this work for us? And then those local stories, right? People who are affected by climate change and experiencing it in real time. And they're often marginalized communities, like a lot of times. So that's the environmental justice component of it. So I think those 2 points are really important for climate change, or, something that people really care about. And Lisa, when you talk about redistribution of species, so we have a feature coming out in July about that topic, about salmon in the Arctic and Pacific salmon in Norway. Right, and Pacific, and kind of crowding out those the native Atlantic species, the wild species that are left there, and in the UK, these mostly pink salmon are showing up. So that is something I think our region would care about, because there are fish to a certain extent, right? And they're not necessarily, pinks aren't going away; they're still here, but they are expanding their range. So that kind of thing, I think, would get people interested.
I would definitely agree with that. Like the show that we work on, solutions are like a part of every episode. And, there's the episodes that are much more about adaptation. So you could, if you think of solutions in this narrow band, it could be like, well, the thing we need to do is stop climate change, and talk about that every episode. That's not what we do, because in many of those cases, it's like, okay, what is the acute solution to, recurrent flooding in a region because of more extreme weather? Whether it may not be sea level rise, but it may be sort of that the spring flooding comes really quickly. We've had some stories in Canada about that. And so then talking, having those discussions about managed retreat and about what, maybe people need to be moving away from these places at risk. Now, like, how does that work in someone's brain? Like part of what it is, in terms, like having talked to people who study communication, is that we know that fear only has this real tendency to shut it down in terms of being able to pay attention and be engaged in something. If there is no sense of fear, then you might not sort of have that interest in the first place. But fear with a little bit of hope, a little bit of someone doing something for a reason, mixed in there is, like in terms of communications literature, and which has been done more with health than with climate change, but it seems to somewhat hold up, even though all audiences are different, and you can never like blanket have one good communications policy for one thing. That formula seems to sort of work on our brains in a way that I think is useful to remember. And a lot of people are focusing on solutions journalism. I think that's key when you talk about climate change, both to make the stories different, but then also to be like, okay, here are the people on a quest trying to do something about it. Here are the local folks affected by it, and to make those things more sort of acute and tangible in a way that that our brains can digest.
Yeah, and another part of those studies, communication studies, show that younger people, you really lose them when it's disaster, that in their minds, they're not responsible for, right? So doing the work, like I think Natalie just put up, doing the work and giving some amount of hope, because there is hope. It's not a disingenuous hope.
There's also a question of, who is trusted in this message? I mean, one, the media has to be trusted, the reporter has to be trusted, the story has to be trusted, but who are we talking to? Because obviously people listen to people who are trusted, they trust. And so that becomes really important, because I think if we're talking to people who are at various levels of disbelief or unbelief, you know, it really matters who do they trust in order to be able to hear the message.
I think that this really gets to this important issue of audience agency or readership agency. People want to feel like they are engaged, that they trust, that they can follow up and sort of do things that help to sort of, you know, connect to the story somehow. And so there is a question here that I think is appropriate, which is, this was directed towards Linda. Do you know ways that we can support what is happening at the Fairy Creek blockade, or I suppose any other sort of environmental events that are happening in the region?
Well, if we're talking about the Fairy Creek blockade, I actually sent that person an answer to that question. I mean, there's a live news feed that you can log on to if you want to literally get the play-by-play what's going on out there. And I can put that back in the chat so everyone can see it. But I mean, I guess I want to just reconnect to Jude's point about the despair factor. I mean, I think one of the things that I would encourage everyone to use in their storytelling, and it's just in the living of their life, is the gorgeousness of the living world, the incredible beauty of this vast intelligence that we're so privileged to live in, of nature. I don't care if you're talking about something as small as an insect or as grand as an old growth tree. There is something to care about and invest in and take care of. And, you know, I try to bring a sense of wonder into every one of these stories. Like, why should I care? Well, one of the reasons you should care is because it's just so incredibly beautiful. And the genius of the design of the natural world and how it all just works is of endless interest. And so I would encourage anyone who wants to be involved, get involved and stay involved. Let yourself be seduced by the wonder of this place where we live. There's endless fuel there. And I also see in the chat here people talking about Robin Wall Kimmerer and her point that, you know, one antidote to despair is work. Well, isn't that the truth? You know, get involved, be involved, stay involved. And you know, the native people of this place, I don't hear a lot of despair coming out of them. And, you know, what I hear from them is a commitment to the work of continuing on their cultures and continuing on their faithfulness to sustaining this world that we're deeply embedded in and part of. We don't get some like special climate change deal where it all works out okay for humans. It's just everything else that gets creamed. I promise it really doesn't work that way. And in fact, humans are the most fragile, pathetic little beings of all. We only do well in a narrow little band of temperature. We need to eat every day. We have these incredibly complex social dynamics that require a fair amount of stability. Witness how well we did in the pandemic. And if you think the pandemic was bad, wait till you see climate change. I mean, this is a warm up for what's ahead if we can't get a handle on this thing. But rest assured, nature really does bat last. I mean, we can reset all the way to rock and ice on this planet. We can redo the Cretaceous. We're headed there. It doesn't matter. You know, a couple 100 million years from now, some other being will dig in our layer and say, hey, who were they? They really liked plastic. I mean, so don't fool yourself. We are the tiniest little crummiest being on this planet in terms of our ability to sustain what's coming if we can't get this done. In terms of access to fresh water, food, civil stability, we are the least resilient species. The Indian people talk about the poor, pathetic ones that the animals rescued in the time when animals spoke a language that we could understand. I mean, so this is a time for humility and purpose. Certainly not whining, and certainly not wondering, gee, why should I bother? Spare me. This is a time to begin and work.
So I have to jump in here. Linda says, doing the work and getting involved and that kind of thing. So right now I'm working on this this newsletter. I do this editor's newsletter, and this time it's about. I was looking into commercial community supported fisheries, right? How do they, do they work? Can we change our supply chains? Can we change the food network to be more equitable, to have access to local food, not just global food, that kind of thing. And one of the things I came across was, the whole vote with your fork, that Michael Pollan 2006 Omnivore's Dilemma kind of thing. And really, vote with your fork doesn't really work all that much, right? You're substituting being a consumer. We're substituting citizenship with consumerism. And that's not what it's about, right? Being a consumer is an individual choice. Yes, it can raise awareness, maybe educate people, but it only takes you so far. It doesn't change things. Legislation changes things, right? And legislation changes when people in a democracy demand changes, right? And that actually takes work. That takes digging in and doing the work. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
To that point, I would say that, oh, sorry, can I jump in? That I think there has been, at least on climate change, like much too much media talk about what you can do in your own life and too little about the larger legislative, the big systems, those kinds of stories that and there's the news bias reasons that I mentioned that I think lead to that. It's like easier to talk about, but it's not sufficient at all.
I think after years and years of doing, environmental activism, I think that, one of the things that, you realize is that, it does take, a change in the laws. It does take that kind of leadership at that level to make a difference. And I think that the role, we used to have a program called, Adopt a Politician, just like you adopt a road, and things like that, but adopt your politician. And when the politician does good stuff, say, atta boy, atta girl. And when they don't do good stuff, say what kind of good stuff they should be doing. In other words, the accountability aspects of elected officials, becomes very, very important. Otherwise, we don't end up with good laws. We pass laws also without ending up with good enforcement. And so, there's a whole thing of, being engaged. And I think that's one of the things that we came to understand.
We had a couple of questions that were focused on this hyper-local dimension of Cascadia. And I think they're worth exploring because, there are 4 of you, there are probably dozens of people working on this beat in the region, maybe more, but there's a lot of ground to cover. And the first question is, how do we do a better job of understanding and tracking water quality and water quantity issues with our cross-boundary salmon streams, for example, in Whatcom County and Lower British Columbia? Is there an international effort in place yet for these streams? And another question is, how can local communities learn about the environmental challenges and occasional successes in their own backyards that lie in the Salish Sea watershed? So any sort of perspectives on how we sort of scale up this kind of media coverage in light of the sort of journalistic challenges and the size, the vastness of these places that we're talking about?
That's a tough one to answer. Like, I get up in the morning and I read many different publications, right? And then I listen to CBC radio in the evening, the 6 o'clock news. I look at my newsletter, and then locally. So I have this global component I'm reading. I read The Economist, and I read the BBC and the New York Times. And then I go to my Times Colonist and my Capital Daily newsletter, and I go to the Tyee in Vancouver. And, I'm not sure that's any different than what I did when I was younger, when I had magazines and newspapers or whatever. I just kind of do it all online or on my phone now. And Yeah, I think it's just our job, my job as an editor is to be widely read in many different publications, and with different lenses, business, environmental, health, or whatever. But I also thought my job as a citizen when I was younger was to read publications widely as well. And my first degree is in political science and history. So sometimes my textbooks in university was a subscription to the New York Times, right? So I don't know how you get around that. Like, I think you need to read and watch and view and listen widely. I don't know if that answers the question or is the answer you wanted.
Well, I thought you did a great job of addressing issues around sort of what readers can do to sort of fill the gaps on their own, because and this connects, I think, a lot to the challenges facing community newspapers that we alluded to earlier. And so it's connecting the readership issues to the media ecology and business model issues moving forward. Okay, I think we're good. We only have about 5 minutes left with the session, but I did want to see if we could address just maybe one more question here. And I want to get back to the issue of Canadian-American dynamics, and sort of a two-pronged question. Do we sometimes get locked in our respective sort of national or jurisdictional bubbles when it comes to adequately reflecting the cross-border experience? And a second question, this might be more difficult to answer, but are there different sort of cultural practices in play when it comes to reporting in Canada versus reporting in the United States? Lisa, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I just saw Linda's hand up, so I was waiting, but sure. I mean, I definitely think we're in our bubbles. And I think that, just circling that, we've said a lot of reasons why that's not a good idea. And circling back to the solutions thing, the idea that another jurisdiction is doing something different in the same part of nature is a very compelling kind of solution to look at, right? And why it's happening. I mean, I think one of the differences between Canadian and American media is that Canadian media are very used to public officials not speaking very publicly. It's often a common refrain when you get an American police officer, just thinking in the general news, or lawyer, or county official or whatever, that they'll talk to you and say words like a human, in a way that Canadian officials were so used to getting a statement 2 hours after deadline. And so that's a frustration being in Canada. But that question of accountability and even just knowing who to go to, and being able to bake that in, that's a fixable problem. But it is one, I think, a little hurdle that would get in the way of you get used to, how to reach all of the right government areas and officials and whatever in your beat and in your region, and stretching that out to other places, and whether it involves municipalities or states or the feds or whatever, can add complexity to a reporter's day, that you'd need to be sort of building up some contacts for that, to help get over it. I mean, so I think part of it is practical and part of it is a mindset.
Linda? Oh, I'm sorry, Jude.
I have to add that as an editor for many years, and working with American and Canadian journalists, and it's better than it used to be for me in the 6 years I've been at Hackeye Magazine, probably because I work with a lot of the same writers now. But I find my American writers tend to be very American centric, and I really have to remind them to look for examples in Canada, right? In Australia, in whatever, just because we're a global publication, we cover coasts around the globe. So our even though most of our readers are actually American, followed by Canadians. So yes, we know who our audience is, but we have a global distribution. We look at it from a broad context. And so I find that Canadian writers tend to be a little bit more, less provincial, I guess, in a way. And then my American writers, I really have to push and remind them to look further than the US, even though so much is happening there. And I get it. Like there's such a lot of great things happening, a lot of great examples, a lot of bad examples, right? But yeah, so that's one thing culturally I've noticed is really looking outside of your country.
Linda. Oh, your microphone's on. Off.
My comment was really a tail to an earlier question, but I'll just briefly state that in terms of news and where do you get it, I'd like to call out that we are in the age of DIY, do it yourself. I mean, journalism has never been so democratized, small d, as now. I mean, because of the internet and because of the incredible easy access to putting out, say, your own newsletter or writing for a blog or writing for someone else's blog. If you've got something to say and you think there's an issue that's not getting the spotlight, go do it. I mean, we live in an incredible ecology of information right now, and jump right in or find a way to contribute to an existing news source that you think is missing what needs to be covered. I mean, just right here in Seattle, we have seen the rise of so many new online venues for news, serious reporting, from Crosscut Public Media to Post Alley, which is a blog that just started up 2 years ago and takes on all kinds of public affairs topics. I'm just talking about Seattle, and not to mention all these hyper-local neighborhood blogs. These are actually vital mycorrhizal connections to community news. And so if you don't think it's being covered, get to it. I mean, I wouldn't say just leave it to those of us working at these larger institutional so-called legacy media. We have a role, it's a critical role. If you look at most of what gets aggregated to all these other different places, it comes from people like us. We're kind of the base of the food chain for information, but it sure doesn't stop with us. And if you don't think it's being covered, do it. Do it yourself. You'll find out, by the way, it's not as easy as you think. Getting actual, true, real information from a diversity of sources. When people call me up and bitch about some minor something or another, I think, if you think it's so easy, you try it. I don't think you'd last a day. So, be forewarned. This is hard work. It's tough work, and it's work that should come with a heavy sense of accountability. I sign everything I write. My phone number and my email address is at the bottom of every story. Who else lives with that? I mean, it is a public trust, and I know everyone on this panel takes it very seriously, but I would invite anyone who thinks that there's stuff out there that's not getting covered, and I would certainly agree that's the case. Don't think it can't be done. Find a way.
So when I worked in newspapers, I used to always say to people, but think of how much they got right.
That's funny.
I think we're going to leave it on that note, a very hopeful note. And by the way, that's a good reminder, Linda, that all of you have ways to be reached via email for those who want to discuss potential stories. So we're going to leave it there. Please have a look in the chat for some of the publications and some of the great projects that these wonderful panelists have been up to. So again, I just wanted to thank the panelists, just amazing insights today, and for all of your time and ideas, and for sharing across the border. Thank you once again to our panelists and to our partners as well. And Natalie?
Yes, just want to echo that thanks, and many thanks to the Alumni Association as well for hosting this call, and for all of you for listening in. And we will be following up with the links that we've shared and a link to this recording. And thanks again, everyone, for your time and insights today. It's been really fascinating to listen in. Thank you.
It's been fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.